In winter of 1959, 9 Soviet hikers embarked on an expedition in hopes to graduate to a grade 3 level certification, one of the highest certifications given at the time. These hikers were actually students and some recent graduates from the Ural Polytechnic Institute. They were some of the most experienced hikers the school ever had. But after today's video, you'll learn that even the most experienced hikers can be subject to inexplicable tragedies. Hello friends, and welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, welcome. If you tuned in last week, then you might recall me saying that it was gonna take me a little longer to gather information on this specific case because I was reading a book related to the case, but I'm done with it now. As you can see, all I've gotta say is the lengths that some of these people went to figure out what happened with today's case with these hikers, I gotta give them credit. So the book is called Dead Mountain by Donnie Eicher or Eicher, I'm not really sure. I will give you guys my opinion on the book as a whole, but that'll be till the very end. So anyway, let's just jump right into today's case. The name behind the Dyatlov Pass comes from the leader of the group, Igor Dyatlov. Aside from being a radio engineer student at UPI, Igor, who was 23 at the time, was an avid enthusiast of all things science. He gained loads of popularity because of his intelligence and attention to detail when it came to all things outdoors. He was a leader, and if you wanted to be a part of his group, you had to earn it. In February of 1959, Igor would lead a group of 9 students into one of the most treacherous expeditions in Russia. All of them were grade 2 hikers and were striving to finally reach a grade 3 certification. And in order to do so, you would have to be out for at least 16 days and cover at least 186 miles of ground. In the 1950s, Russia had nothing extravagant to offer. There was poverty in parts of the country, but ultimately a wave of deep stoicism. It's almost as if these hikers relied on adrenaline-inducing activities like hiking trips to make up for the setting in which they lived in. So the rest of Igor's group consisted of 7 men and 2 women. Zinaida Komolgorova, or Zina for short, was one of the 2 women who earned a spot in Igor's group. Zina was 22 years old and was also earning her degree in radio engineering. Zina thrived in a male-dominated field, and above all, she was very quick to strike a good conversation. So many people actually gravitated towards her, and it was even rumored some of the members of the group had secret crushes on her. The second woman in the group was Lyudmila Dubinina, or Lyuda for short. Lyuda was 20 years old, making her the youngest of the group. So she was studying construction industry economics, and although she was a little more of a serious person, the group admired her for her strength. And actually, on a previous hiking trip, Lyuda was shot in the leg by a group member when they mishandled a hunting rifle. And although she had to be carried away, people commended her for her optimism with the entire situation. So the rest of Igor's group were all men. 3 of these men were named Yuri. Something tells me it was a popular name back then. In order to avoid any confusion, these Yuris either went by a nickname or their own last name. The first Yuri was Yuri Yudin. So Yuri was 21 years old and he was referred to as Yudin. Yudin was a geology student and the 10th member of the group. Yudin always kept his spirits high in an effort to overshadow the health problems that he had. He was diagnosed with rheumatism and it resulted in pain with his joints and bones. And on top of that, he was dealing with a congenital heart defect. I mean, it's clear to see that Yudin was always in pain, but just like the rest of the group, he wanted to get that grade 3 certification. Now, the second Yuri of the group was Yuri Doroshenko, but the group called him by his last name. He was 21 years old, and in school, he often was with Zina and Igor because he too was studying radio engineering. Now, the third Yuri was Yuri Krivonishchenko, referenced as Georgie. So he was 23 years old, and he was the jokester of the group. Not in a bad way, but he was just always cracking jokes, and he was so good at storytelling. He was also one of the two musicians of the group. In his free time, he played the mandolin, and he figured he'd take it with him to lift the group's spirits up when needed. And I want to say he had probably the biggest personality of the group. And of course, that often came in handy. Now, Georgie was studying hydraulics and construction at the time. Alexander Kolevatov, often called by his last name, was studying nuclear physics, and he was 24 years old. Kolevatov was very private, and one can assume almost shy. Now, second to last was Rustem Slobodin, nickname Rustik. Now, he was often called the rich kid of the group. He was 23 years old, and he came from very wealthy parents who were both professors. He was studying mechanical engineering and was very talented at playing the mandolin as well. So he was the second musician of the group. And last but not least, there was Nikolai, and I'm sorry, I'm not gonna say that last name, just because I don't want to butcher it, and I mean no disrespect as well. Now, he was referenced as Koila. He was 23, and he had already graduated from UPI, and so he earned his civil construction degree. Now, you have all 10 members, and at the very last minute, one of Igor's acquaintances actually asked Igor if he could join the group. His name was Alexander Solotaryov, but he went by Sasha. He was the oldest member, standing at 38 years old. Now, Sasha was actually a hiking instructor and a World War II veteran, and although he was considered pretty old at that time, he was in school trying to earn his degree in military engineering. And look, now that the size of the group was 11 total, they still all got along pretty well. They thrived in the simplicity of just going out and challenging themselves to reach new limits. Now, the reason we know so much about this expedition, even decades later, is because they all kept journals and diaries of any kind. Each morning, they would write about the events that took place the day before. Some would also keep random conversations that would happen throughout the day. You gotta remember, it's the 1950s. Nobody could just pull up a cell phone and record anything. So in one of Zena's diary entries, actually, right before they took off for their journey, she wrote, "I wonder what awaits us in this hike. Will anything new happen?" So Igor and his group settled on the idea to reach Otorten Mountain, located in the northern Urals. And in order to do so, they would have to leave their city, which was called Sverdlovsk, and travel north through several regions for hundreds of miles. It's January/February when they decide to make this trip. The weather conditions over there are extremely unpredictable. I mean, it's labeled a frozen hell for a reason. Now, with sub-zero temperatures and extreme weather conditions ahead of them, the group worked together to keep their spirits high and their minds on the end goal. Now, in order to avoid any mistakes, the group actually made a pact to leave all alcohol contents and all cigarette contents completely behind. Now, the only alcohol they did carry was completely medicinal, and Yurin was actually the one in charge of it. On January 24th, 1959, the students landed in Serov, a town 200 miles north of Sverdlovsk. So the group traveled by train, and once they arrived, they quickly learned that their next departure to the next town, Ivdel, wouldn't be until the later evening. This is just kind of a fun fact, but when they first arrived, Georgie tried to play his mandolin to kind of kill time, and he was detained by a Soviet officer who was quick to shut down the whole thing. After he was let go, Igor and the rest of the group set out to find a place to rest, since the night for them was pretty rough. Eventually, they landed at the front door of a local school. Now, this school was called School Number 41, and the schoolmaster at the time agreed to let the group in to rest if, in exchange, they would give a presentation to the children later about hiking, and of course, they agreed. You see, the town of Sedov didn't see many hikers, which is why after their presentation on all things adventure, The students were in awe and they just didn't want the group to leave. But at last, the group said their goodbyes and they took off once again by train to Ivdel. So once they arrived in Ivdel, they had to wait about half a day for their bus to take them to the last civilized town before they started their expedition. Their wait was a little anticlimactic, if I'm being honest, because all they did was really wait around the bus station. Many of them didn't even say much or want to say much just because it was so cold. Either that or they were just too tired. At last, a GAZ 651 bus pulled up to the bus stop. Their bus trip was crowded, to say the least. So on top of locals using this bus for the evening, the students had to fit their gear along with themselves inside, which obviously resulted in them being crammed up. And honestly, this didn't matter too much to them because this bus ride would just result in them being one step closer to their final destination. Around 2 p.m. the following day, the group landed in Vizay, a town that was built primarily by Gulag prisoners and men who simply worked for free. Now, the students found the Vizay cafeteria, and this would serve them a hot meal and a vibe that reminded them so much of home. Now, this made the group kind of unwind and sort of take the load off for the evening. I assume they were just feeling so many different emotions. So it just makes sense. And honestly, you can tell they were having a good time because they took loads of pictures. They just gathered around and had a good time. So the town of Vizay is usually the last pit stop to mail out any postcards to family members. But before they made their way into the bare wilderness, Igor had met someone in town who grew a big liking to him and his expedition with his friends. The man who was a director/manager for the men who worked on the town of Vizay enjoyed the company of Igor and the rest of the group so much that he insisted they stay at least one more night. It would allow them to get better rest, better quality food, and overall prepare themselves for the journey to the mountains. So they ended up staying while trying to mentally prepare for this excruciatingly hard journey. On January 28th, 1959, the group made their way to an abandoned geological site called Nord 2. This would be the last human settlement before actually entering the wilderness. Now, it's actually here that Yurin is just at an all-time high with his pain. Sometime before that, he warned the group and said that his pain was flaring up, but that it was manageable. But at this point, he just couldn't take it anymore. Here at Nord 2 is where he couldn't push any further, and he had no choice but to abandon his comrades. Now, of course, everybody was bummed out because they all wanted to make it to their destination together, but they knew that it was for the better to just let him go. Now, they said their goodbyes and watched as Yurin rode back to Sverdlovsk. Now, although they left their friend behind, the group was finally able to start their route. So Igor and his group made it so that they were able to travel alongside a couple of rivers. First, it was the Losva River and then the Ospia. The Ospia River would eventually lead them to their destination, Otorten Mountain. Here, there was no buses, no trains. It was all skiing all the way up to the mountain. And according to their journal entries, it wasn't all too eventful. It was quiet and they took turns leading the group up north. They stopped and took pictures, some proof that they were really up there in the mountains, while some pictures were actually just for fun. Where it did become dangerous is when they'd ski on the river, and so they had to be really careful not to break the ice because at the time it was incredibly thin. Now, their trip was actually a little easier once they started to notice noticed there was a ski path to ride over. These ski paths were made by Mansi hunters. The Mansi are a group of indigenous people who back then settled west of the Urals. Their traditional way of living can be described as semi-nomadic hunters. During the winter, they lived in stationary huts and raised reindeer. The Mansi were very kind and very generous people, and they didn't really like violence of any kind. So to Igor's group, seeing the ski paths was not really a threat, but rather a helping hand. Now the second day just consisted of even more skiing, more silence, some picture taking, some journal entries. Not really too eventful. On January 30th, the group celebrated Doroshenko's 21st birthday, and as a surprise, they gave him a tangerine. Tangerines were only available during a short period of time in Russia. They were considered very special and were usually given out on New Year's Day. And that day, Doroshenko decided to share the tangerine with everyone in the group. Zina would later write in her journal saying, "One more day passed by safely." January 31st would be the last documented day in the group's diaries. According to Igor's entry, the group set out at 10 in the morning. The weather was incredibly dangerous, with strong winds blowing unexpectedly. The winds were so strong, it created the illusion that it was snowing. Temperatures were still in the negatives, and not to mention, there was snow as far as the eye could see. But regardless, Otorten Mountain was the goal, and they wouldn't dare turn back now. Later in Igor's entries, he explains that the weather seemed to only get worse. It got so bad that they would often be walking blindly, only able to cover half a mile to a mile per hour. He explains how the wind is so piercing, it blows so fast, like when a plane takes off. By 4 p.m., they were all worn out, and they started to look for a place to set up camp. They chose a spot south of the Ospia Valley, where it was the least windy. They made their tent, and later that evening, while everyone was eating dinner, Igor wrote what is known as the last journal entry, and it goes as follows. "It's hard to imagine such cozy place anywhere at the ridge, under the piercing howls of the wind, and hundreds of kilometers from any settlements." The next morning, February 1st, 1959, there was a total of 10 pictures taken, and it seemed like everybody was just pretty happy and in good spirits. Now, the group had created this temporary storage where they could store non-essential equipment in order to pack lighter as they were heading up the mountain. And these pictures right here were some of the last taken. Now that day, the sun would set at 5 p.m. and in about an hour, they'd be faced with nothing but darkness. Although they tried to move as fast as they could, it took them several hours to set up camp. Now, the area where they set up their camp would become known as the Dyatlov Pass. The place where they made their tent was located on the eastern slope of the Holochal mountain, often called Dead Mountain. Now, for reference, Dead Mountain has an altitude of 1,079 meters or 3,540 feet. So they finished setting up camp at around 9 p.m. And with everyone just huddled inside the tent already, they were just anticipated for the next day. They were so close to reaching Otorten Mountain. After so many miles and miles of skiing in extremely cold conditions, they were just 12.4 miles away from their destination. Unfortunately, no one from the Dyatlov group would wake up to reach their destination, because on the night of February 1st, 1959, something gut-wrenching happened. February 12th was the day the group was expected back to Visay, but after no one showed up and after Igor failed to send out a telegram to the sports club back at the university, people began to worry. It was common to return back a day, maybe 2 days late, because this expedition was pretty extreme. But once a few more days passed, everyone began to worry. Families reached out to the university administration, and they were asking if they could send out a search plane because they just felt like something was off. But the university refused. February 19th, a telegram goes out to the university from Bizet saying that the Dyatlov group had not made it back. It wasn't until February 20th when they started to send out a search team. They searched the riverbanks, they spoke to various people who came in contact with them, but nothing useful came up. On February 26th, 1959, Boris Slopstov and Michael Sheravin locate the Dyatlov group's tent on the east slope of Dead Mountain. Now, this tent was just torn up pretty badly. The following day, the search groups moved to this area and, try and locate the Dyatlov group. They find that 20 yards south of the tent, 9 set of footprints were discovered. Later that day, the bodies of Doroshenko and Georgie were found near a cedar tree just a mile down from the tent. They also recovered the bodies of Igor and Zina. Igor was found 1,300 yards from the tent, and Zina was found 300 yards from Igor. Now, at this point, a man named Lev Ivanov replaces the current prosecutor, and so he arrives via helicopter to where the bodies were found. The bodies were transported from Butrach to Ivdel via plane. On March 2nd, they find the temporary storage that the Dyatlov group created. The one that the group made in order to store their non-essential gear. Because time is of the essence, on March 4th, they begin the autopsies for Igor, Zina, Georgie, and Doroshenko. While that's going on, they discovered the body of Rustik, who was found between Igor and Zina. They transport his body with the tent for further investigation. So at this point, Yudin, who, if you remember, had to leave and cut his expedition short because he was in pain, he has already heard the news. And Lev, the prosecutor, has asked him at this point to be flown to Ivdel to help identify what items belong to who inside the temporary storage. There's just so many moving pieces, so bear with me here. Meanwhile, back in Sverdlovsk, they're holding a funeral for the first 5 Dyatlov members, and Yudin was unable to attend because he was busy identifying what items belong to who. It's just so heartbreaking. There's actually a part in the book that I read where the author explains that at some point Yudin was flying back to Sverdlovsk, and with him was a forensic pathologist who at the same time was transporting organs that belonged to some of Yudin's friends. Yudin explains it's one of the most heartbreaking and one of the most uncomfortable things he's ever had to do in his life. 4 students remain unfound: Lyuda, Sasha, Koila, and Kolevatov. From March 18th through the 30th, a forensic pathology report comes back and reveals that the first 5 students died of hypothermia. So with this information, what did they face prior to hypothermia? Look, I'm going to come back to the autopsy report in just a minute. There was a point in the investigation where the snow had just been so bad that it slowed down part of the investigation. It wasn't until May 4th, 1959, when the snow was now melting, that they discovered the remaining bodies. Lyuda, Sasha, Koila, and Kolevatov were all found at the bottom of a ravine. Now, because so much time has passed, their bodies are so badly decomposed that they need to fly them out ASAP. But because there was some weird drama between the pilots and the prosecutor, it wasn't until 4 days later, on May 8th, that the bodies were flown out. Time is so crucial when it comes to these sorts of things, so I think it's so stupid that some weird drama had to get in the way of something so vital. So on May 9th, this forensic pathologist is doing the autopsy, and he notices that 3 of the 4 students have violent injuries. Now, while they did have to do a closed casket for the remaining 4 students, I have to explain what the pathologist meant by violent injuries. Let's just go back to the first autopsy. Doroshenko and Georgie were found shoeless and only had underwear on. Actually, most of them had no shoes on, which is something everyone is so curious about. So as you see in this figure, their bodies laid next to a tree that had like broken branches up to 5 meters high, meaning one of them could have possibly climbed the tree to find their campsite. Igor, Zina, and Rustik were found in poses that indicated they were trying to make their way back to the tent. The remaining 4 students, Lyuda, Sasha, Koila, and Kolevatov, were better dressed than the other students. Lyuda was wearing some burned trousers that belonged to Georgie. Her left foot and shin had been wrapped in someone's torn jacket. Now, while 6 of the 9 students died of hypothermia, according to the reports, 3 of them did not. And because of this, it completely changed the narrative to how these students died. So Koila died of a fatal skull injury. Sasha died from severe chest trauma. But what's even more peculiar is the way Lyuda died. Lyuda was found with severe internal bleeding from some sort of chest trauma. Whatever caused the chest trauma, it had to be so impactful that it resembled the same force of a car crash. On top of this, Lyuda was missing her eyes, parts of her lip, facial tissue, some skull bone, but also her tongue was completely missing as well. Sasha had his eyes missing, and Kolevatov had his eyebrows missing. Now, at first glance, there's so many things that could have caused this, but according to the post-mortem exam, this most likely happened due to the decomposition because of the location of where they were found, which was near a body of water. Okay, so now that we have covered the autopsy reports, let's dive into the theories, because there's a few. So there's this theory that an avalanche could have killed these students. In the beginning, I did say that when their tent was found, it was torn up pretty badly. What forensics actually discovered was, given the precision and the form, these cuts came from inside the tent, and they were made with a knife. Going back to the theory, an avalanche was coming down on them and the group panicked. They were poorly dressed because they had been sleeping. They slashed through the tent in order to escape the worst, but that has been thrown out the window because when search teams found the tent, it was clearly secured to the ground. If an avalanche were to have occurred, their bodies would have most likely been swept away a lot further, and they'd be buried in even deeper snow. The area had no indications of any recent avalanches either. The footprints found also didn't indicate any sort of panic, but rather considered to be consistent with a normal walking pace. The next theory is a theory that the Mansi people invaded and killed them off, but the closest Mansi group was 60 miles away. Also, the footprints found only indicated 9 people were in the area at the time. The Mansi usually never traveled to the area where the group was because there was just nothing out there for them that they were interested in. Plus, like I said, the Mansi are very generous people. They stayed away from violence, and it just wasn't in their nature to kill. We have the high winds theory. Investigators for quite some time believe some students might have gone out of the tent to urinate, and a sudden wind could have knocked them away, and in an effort to save them, the rest of the group followed suit. But it's not reasonable, because then the tent would have been blown away too if the winds were that strong. Plus, one of the students, Rustik, was found wearing a hat, so wouldn't it have come off if, again, the winds were so strong, and if that was the reason? There's the theory that armed Soviet men were involved with their deaths, whether that was prisoners held anywhere near or just military, but it's been debunked because the tears of the tent came from inside. Why would anyone tear a tent from the inside if they were going to escape something from the outside? Plus, again, 9 set of footprints. That day, there were no reports of prisoners escaping either, with the nearest camp being over 50 miles away. The light orb theory was another possible reason. In 1959, another group of hikers led by Georgy Atmanaki reported seeing these bright light orbs in the sky the night the Dyatlov group died. The orbs could have been something otherworldly, one can assume aliens or military-related testing. But his comrade, who was also a part of that hiking trip, he explained that the sightings actually happened in the middle of February, not February 1st. Other people reported seeing this weird light orb in the middle of February as well. Any military testing is out of the picture, given that the nearest military testing site was 1,200 miles away from where the group set camp. Also, any missiles or rockets that could have been fired that night could only travel up to 100 miles. So, again, debunked. The last picture theory is one that a lot of people have a hard time with. Now, this last picture taken by the group shows little to nothing, but some people believe that the light source right here could be a result of UFO encounters. Now, this small flare has been identified as the camera's blades due to its aperture, but the one on the left has not been identified at all. Now, kind of merging two theories together, there's one piece of information I wanted to say. When the clothing was recovered from the area, it was tested for radiation. When these tests came back, the radiation levels were 2 to 3 times the normal radiation. Experts say the radiation was probably from any previous testing done in the area and was still kind of lingering around in the atmosphere. On top of this radiation, the Dyatlov group was found with sort of a weird tan going on. I'm talking like orange tan, but some scientists believe that it's really just a severe tan. It's possible the bodies could have been uncovered at some point, which would expose them to UV rays, even with the sun not being present. Now, this next theory to me kind of sounds like a more plausible one. So in Donnie Eicher's 2013 published book titled Dead Mountain, he explains that wind traveling around the dome of the top of the mountain could have created something called a Kármán vortex street. The Kármán vortex street works by creating small vortices or small tornadoes under the right circumstances. Now, the theory is that as these small tornadoes spun over the dome of the mountain, they created something called infrasonic waves. Think of infrasonic waves as this inaudible noise pollution, right? These waves have been known to create this sort of constant feeling of anxiety and fear. Some people are more susceptible to it than others, but regardless, it causes these dreadful sort of symptoms. Applying this to the case, because these tornadoes could have gotten large in size, the infrasound would have been that much bigger as well. I mean, just think about the physiological aspect to it. The amount of panic and just fear produced, all while trying to figure out what's going on. Random winds to the left and to the right, inexplicable panic and sudden urge to flee. I mean, again, it seems kind of like the most plausible, but at the end of the day, it's just a theory. Now, the last theory I want to talk about, a 2021 theory conducted by a group of physicists. They theorized that because the tent was pitched in a 90-degree angle, a snow slab could have slid off their tent, and the force would be big enough to be consistent with their injuries. Now, these engineers and physicists, they published a major article, and it just goes into a ton of detail, a lot of equations that go into this theory, and if you're curious about that, I will leave that linked in the description. Now, it's sad to say that all the friends and family of the Dyatlov group, they've all passed away. Those who choose to explore the story keep their memory alive. Rest in peace to those involved in the Dyatlov Pass incident. One more thing I'm gonna mention actually before I let you go. Government officials, when it came to arranging the funeral for the first 5 students, they were so shady. So they wanted to split the funerals into 2 days rather than like 5 days to make it look like only 2 people had passed away and not 5 people. It backfired on Prosecutor Ivanov because word got around pretty quickly and thousands of people showed up to pay their respects for these students. So take that, prosecutor Lev Ivanov. As for the remaining 4 students, they had private funerals and it was only for family members. All 9 students, with the exception of 1, were buried together. Yuri Yudin, the student who had to leave because of his joint pain, once he passed away, he was buried alongside the rest of his comrades. This makes me so emotional. You know, Yuri Yudin kept a teddy bear that one of the women in the group gave him. He kept this teddy bear all throughout his lifetime. And what's even sadder is that they didn't get their grade 3 certification. I think they definitely deserved their certification. They should have been honored with it. Well, we have reached the end of today's case. I can't even tell you how long I've been wanting to cover this case, but I wanted to cover it with me having read the book first. And speaking of this book, it was well written, 4 out of 5 stars. And I only gave it 4 stars instead of 5 because he just talked a lot about himself towards the end. It all ties together. If you choose to read the book, it all ties together. But at the end, I was just like, I just wanted to know about the case. I didn't want to know about him. Sorry, not sorry. If you learned something new, please consider subscribing. And lastly, thank you so much for watching. Stay safe, and I'll see you all in the next one.